You ready?
Yeah.
Ms. Hersey, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
The witness ready?
Yes, sir. Yes, Your Honor.
All right, doctor, let's go ahead and
Okay.
get the juror. You should stand up.
Stand, yeah.
I mean, you don't have to.
But
to
then
let
I
us
stand
know.
for them, yeah.
Jury is present and seated. Everyone else may be seated at this time, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Welcome back. My first question is, did anybody have any exposure to the case outside of the courtroom, or discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else, or do any research related to the case by show of hands? All right, let the record reflect no hands. I hope everyone had a nice lunch. We're going to pick up where we left off, continuation of the direct. Ms. Hersey, you may proceed.
Thank you, Judge. Hi, Dr. Heidi.
Hi, Mrs. Hersey.
I think where we left off, we were discussing instances, both in the records, witness accounts, and by Nicole, of the psychological abuse she suffered at the hands of her mother. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, I
Yes,
want to
Counsel.
ask you just a clarification question. You had mentioned before the break a graduation incident that dealt with a comment that she was an overweight skank or something. Were there two separate instances, one at a mall involving overweight, and then one at graduation involving how she was dressed, if you remember?
Was there one at a mall? There was an incident at a mall, but the one I'm thinking about wasn't specifically about her weight. Now, the one that you asked me about, the overweight stank, that was at graduation.
Okay.
And
What,
then
if
there was-
any other
yeah.
instances of psychological abuse did you reference with regard to either in the records or something Nicole reported to you?
And Counselor, just move this a minute. If I'm able to quote from Joe's clinical interview with me, he said his mom's way of motivating people was to point out your flaws. So that is certainly consistent with psychological abuse. And then the another example, and this is partly why Nicole is, as I would say, as immature, underdeveloped, is that she wasn't allowed to grow up or to individuate. So what we, with kids, when they get into adolescence, they test boundaries, they want to become their own person, and Nicole was not allowed to, or at least her mother had a great deal of input in terms of how she dressed, also about her major when she got to college. And what Joey related, and certainly consistent with what Nicole said to me, was that she didn't have the ability to stand up to her mother. So her mom is not allowing her to become her own person, to individuate. So she basically gets into this thing, or this pattern basically, of doing whatever, like a child, doing what her mom said, basically not growing up, not questioning, not making waves. She is desperately seeking her mother's approval. And the sad thing is that she can't ever seem to get that. She's always, as she said, she's never good enough. One time when she broke down sobbing, I'm never good enough, I'm never going to be good enough. It's like she can't get there. And part of that is because she experiences that the guideposts, in a way, keep moving. And the best example of that is the weight. When, many would argue she didn't have a weight problem. Clearly she wasn't obese. And yet at the same time, her mom was saying, well, she ought to be 110 pounds, and then according to Nicole, 105, then it went to 100. So that's what I mean by the goalposts moving. And that would have been very upsetting. And then this is also substantiated by her friends, or not her friends, but the women at FSU, one of whom clearly was her friend. But they all three girls said that she didn't feel like she could measure up, that her mom didn't approve of the way she was. She wasn't kind of a frilly type of girl. And they noted that Nicole felt very uncomfortable about her body, and that was a result of her mom's wanting her to be other than she was.
You may have mentioned it earlier this morning, but just to clarify, your clinical interview with Joey, where you asked him questions about
Yes.
Nicole's childhood, just the date for that so the jury has that.
Yeah, my recollection, it's definitely in September. I'll give you the exact
And
date.
that's fine, September, but of
2015.
Okay.
And I think I saw Joey, Joseph, but I saw him before he saw Nicole in jail. That's my recollection. So,
September
it's-
15 is fine.
yeah, okay.
Now, any other instances of psychological abuse that you can recall with regard to either the records, interviews, or Nicole reporting that we haven't covered?
Well, we did mention the weight issue. We mentioned the liposuction that she had twice, that she didn't question, that she did because her mom, as she said, her mom's the nurse, and that was what was needed. She had her teeth whitened, and that was another thing that her mom imposed on her. And then, which is clearly an example of psychological abuse, Nicole, her mom wanted her to have LASIK surgery. Nicole was very concerned or frightened of that. A lot of people don't like people or doctors operating on the rise. And according to witness accounts, plus, and I mean the witness, the girls at FSU, and then also to Nicole, she really didn't want it. She was terrified. Her brother said that she was terrified of that. But her mom took her to the doctor, and according to Nicole, when Nicole said she told the nurse or the medical person there she didn't want it, and the nurse said something to the mother indicated her displeasure, so Nicole went along with that. She was willing to do that, and then when they afterwards left the doctor's office, and now Nicole said, I really don't want this LASIK procedure. The mother cursed at her. Again, it was pretty strong, according to what was reported to me, that she was effing ungrateful bitch. I mean, that's what was reported. So Nicole felt like, again, she caved that she had to do this. Now, this is a significant event. I want to just point out that this LASIK procedure happened on August 17th, 2015, which is very close in time to when the first incident happened. And
So we're talking about days from within Bob is killed and Mom.
Yes.
And have you had an opportunity to review the LASIK records? And in fact, is there a notation on there by one of the medical personnel that it indicates the patient was extremely nervous?
Yes, there's that, and there's also the notation of the date. It was the 17th of August, 15, and the procedure was scheduled for the following week, which would have been the 24th of August. That's on the same records I reviewed.
Any other instances of psychological abuse that you documented before we get into the 12 characteristics?
Is it appropriate to give an example with respect to Joe's experience, or just with respect to
just anything with
Nicole's?
Nicole.
Okay, all right. I don't think I somewhat referenced this. One of the roommates mentioned that Nicole, again, was sort of a frilly type of girl, and her mom wanted her to get her hair done. She did that. She wanted to have mom wanted to have the nails done. Now, the significance isn't that she just could never measure up, that her mother wanted her to be something she wasn't. And this is what the other girls, the three FSU women, picked up in interactions with her. She didn't feel good. In fact, she felt defeated by her mom with respect to who she was.
Are these instances of psychological abuse appear to be somewhat consistent throughout Nicole's childhood? Do they appear to be more prevalent in certain areas of her childhood, or is it fair to say consistent throughout?
When I look at the instances that I've mentioned, I would have to say throughout, because when you're looking at a parent that hits a child and curses at a child because she can't do the voicemail correctly, or because she gets a question wrong, we're going back a long time. So those incidents go throughout her childhood, and then they go through college.
All right, Dr. Heidi, when you wrote one of the books that you testified to earlier with regard to children who kill their parents, was there a section in the book that dealt with 12 common characteristics among children who kill their parents? And what was that based on, if you can explain briefly?
Yes, there's a chart that I did, or a table, of 12 characteristics commonly found among severely abused children who kill their parents. I want to make a difference there. So severely abused children who kill their parents. And where that table came from is I reviewed the literature back in late 80s, 90s, and those were in other people's reports and in my clinical evaluations. And then since then, in Understanding Parricide, which was published in 2013, there are many more clinical reports, and those remain consistent. So
these are based on research that you yourself had done in literature that you've reviewed over your career. Can you talk about the 12 characteristics commonly found in abused kids who kill their parents? And which, if any, apply to Nicole? Why don't we go through the ones that apply to Nicole?
Okay, well, Counselor, most of them do. I think 11 out of 12. But if we go to, I'm going to go to page 65.
62.
62, is it? All right. Let me just see. And then, shall I read them, or?
Just tell me which ones apply to Nicole.
All right, well, there are 12. And I would say there are data to support these 11. That there's a pattern of family violence, and that includes the abuse and neglect, and that this isn't only what Nicole experienced. This is growing up in a household where she has seen, according to a doctor's report, Dr. Anderson's, untold episodes of physical and verbal altercations between her mother and father. This is as a child, as really very young, from time of birth to probably 3 or 4 years old.
The next one?
Okay. Second one, youth's attempts to obtain help from others fail. That applies in the sense others were aware of this and yet didn't do anything. And a good example of this, and the family was trying, but they were aware that she was afraid. And in fact, Eric Lear and David Lear both referenced that Nicole would say, please don't tell my mom. She borrowed money on occasion because she needed it for things, not foolishly, I mean, but the conversations would begin or end with, please don't tell my mom. So, and in fact, they did try, as I said earlier, I testified, they tried to help her. But the point is, others knew, and yet she didn't get that type of help. And in fact, that one incident where, I don't know if, I can only tell you, I read it in the deposition, Eric Lear said they were having, they were at the Wing House. They had been at the mall, they had a time together, they were eating, and then she left, Nicole left to go off on her own for a little while. And the family got worried. Where was she? And they called the mom, and the mom came. They called the mom because they were concerned. Nicole came back from shopping or whatever, and they said, oh, we called your mom's on the way. And she, according to Eric Lear, cried and just said, please, something like, don't let me go, or something along those lines. And he talked about seeing the fear in her eyes and that it was genuine. So, here's like an example where people are seeing this. She knows they're seeing it, and yet, for whatever reasons, they're not in a position where they feel they can act. So that's what I mean by she's gone to others for help. And
Number 3?
Yeah. 3, her efforts to escape the family situation fail. And you see this, she goes to the grandmothers, the maternal grandmothers, and she likes that. Apparently the maternal grandmother was affectionate, she said, she had a good time there. But then, this is a good example of Florida Air Academy. She was doing well in the 7th grade, I think it was the 7th grade there. And the mother wanted her to go to Florida Air Academy, and Eric said, the depositions, or said, yeah, I didn't talk to him, so it had to be in the deposition, I read it, that she was really doing well in that environment and they didn't want her to go, but the mother who was being deployed wanted her there. So what I'm talking about here, it was an escape. Grandma's was an escape. Anime, I don't know if that's been talked about. She was very heavily into anime. She drew it, she role played, she watched it, and her mother devalued that, said it was, I don't like to say these words, but it was shit, and may have said effing shit. So, that was an escape. Not necessarily a healthy one, but that's, again, another example of an escape. She also tells a very concrete one where they're having this, the mother is upset with her. I think she's in the 10th grade. I'd have to look at my notes exactly what it was. Was it the handwriting thing? And Nicole runs to the bathroom and locks the door, and the mother is banging on the door and tells her to come out. Again, there's cursing. It's the F word is what was reported. Nicole caves and comes out. So it's like she can't get away from this. Then she goes, to London. Now, this is certainly a good thing, but she's doing okay in London because she's away from that, and she's not afraid that her mom is going to suddenly appear. This is an issue with her, that her mom is going to suddenly appear and she's going to get angry. So these are all examples. Plus, which is really probably the most troubling of all, Nicole considered suicide and also made an attempt at suicide through pills. So these are all examples of her wanting to get away, to get out of that situation.
Number 4?
The youth is isolated from other people. And that's true. That's another one that applies. Now, some of this is because clearly of her history. Nicole was not accepted early on. This is from Joey Joseph's account. She's not accepted in school. She was bullied. She didn't fit in. This is reported at the Florida Air Academy. It's at FSU. Now, at FSU, it's kind of understandable. She's got mental health problems. Hygiene is poor. It's offensive to deal with her. So they reject her, understandably, except for these 2 girls, Laura and Angelica. So she's isolated. And what does she do? She goes into her computer. She creates a whole world in there, because on your computer, and she said, it's in my report, it was her peace, her tranquility, her escape. Because on the computer, she could interact with people. She could be powerful, in my words, but she wasn't judged. She had a life there. So that's very isolated. But she's not like going to parties, like, again, as a college professor, what do normal kids do? They date, they hang out with their friends, they go out drinking with their friends. At a place like FSU, a girl is in a sorority. She's not doing any of that stuff. She's by herself for the most part, except she does have a friendship with Laura. But she's isolating hours and hours a day. And even when she went to go see Joey at his home in the summer, Joey had to make ground rules. And the ground rules were, you got to converse with us, come and talk to the wife, Joey, and the children. You got to come out of the room. You've got to shower. You've got to get off the computer, because he said she had this weird connection. You have to put the computer down. and you must shower. So the isolation is unquestionably noticed by people across the board.
Number 5.
Home life becomes increasingly intolerable. And I think this applies, and this is where you can see the mental health deterioration. You know, she sees it, and you have to remember, it's her perceptions that are critical here. She sees what's going on in her life is she's a failure because of her mental health problems. She's got all of these results of things that are sort of natural consequences. She's failing, why? Because she's not going to classes. You know, that's one example. She's not paying attention because she's in a fog, so she loses her bicycle. She doesn't know where it is. She loses the key to the storage room. All these things because of her mental health deterioration. So she's thinking that her mom is going to be very upset by all this. And so this whole thing of her mom coming home and her expected wrath, and then this is Nicole's mind, I would think, rather than reality. But she thinks her stepfather is spying on her. She told me, she told the other doctor, she's been consistent, that he watched her going to see how much she was eating in the refrigerator. She thinks they were snooping through her stuff. I have no idea. But she doesn't feel like many people do, that home is a safe place. She feels like she's in a state of hypervigilance in terms of particularly her mom.
Number 6.
Youth feels trapped and helpless, and this clearly applied. She talks about, to me, and possibly the other doctors, I think she did mention it to at least one of them, this thing about being buried. Well, she may mean it as a metaphor, but it probably does, because she's literally not buried, but this whole sense that she's trapped, she's immobilized, there's no place she can go. And I even said that to her between the first and the second incident, which is, you know, the obvious question, why did you stay? She said, I had no place to go. She feels trapped in that environment, in that home situation. She doesn't have friends. Now, the grandmother would have been, and Joey said this very clearly to me, Joey said, you know, if only she had reached out and said to him, to, I think he meant Uncle Eric, or to the grandmother, they would have helped her. They would have done something. But she didn't realize that. She felt like she's there and there's nobody else. She's trapped in that home situation.
Number 7.
Youth loses control due to inability to cope. And that's, you know, we've talked around the issue of deteriorating mental health and psychosis. You know, from everything that I have seen, what has happened is when she kills the dad and the mother, she's in a state of panic. She's not able, I mean, she's at a point where she loses control. She said to me with respect to both, particularly both incidents, and she said the others the same to, I think maybe the exact words to the doctors, but, you know, she panicked, it just happened. So it's like this idea, there's not like her thinking, you know, here are my choices, I'm going to do this. It's sort of like just, again, a loss of control. And I may be getting ahead here, but with respect to the shooting of her stepfather, she talks about, you know, the gun, holding the gun, basically thinking she's going to kill herself. And then what she does, she says she hears a conversation and her words, panic, and it happens. She shoots him. It's like this whole idea, again, of a loss of control.
Number 8.
Youth has little or no criminal history. Very typical. In this case, it's a severely abused parasite offender. They have either minimal or no criminal history, and she has none that I'm aware of.
A gun is available. Number 9.
Yes, and that's sadly the case in most parasites involving young people. A gun is readily available in the home, so when they are in this state of panic or whatever their circumstances are, the gun is within reach. They're not stealing these guns. They're not going out and buying them. They're in the home where they can get access to them.
10 would be the one I believe you don't think applies, and that is the victim or parent is a heavy user of alcohol or drugs. We don't
No.
have that here.
No evidence of that. In fact, to the contrary.
So number 11?
Evidence to suggest the offender is in a dissociative state in some cases. This was clearly, and I think I've talked about dissociation, this was somebody who dissociated a lot, meaning her grasp on reality is not good. And what she talks about is when she's in the mirror, and this has some significance for her, these mirror incidents, which I can talk about, but at any rate, when she's struggling with this, what she's going to do, she has gaps in memory, not tremendous gaps. She knows that she shot her stepfather and her mother, but this is very consistent with dissociation, with people who are highly stressed, not remembering, and just reacting, basically, and that's what she did.
And the last common characteristic that you believe applies to Nicole?
Yes, and that's the parent's death is frequently perceived as a relief to the offender and to the surviving family members. Well, here I would qualify this. I think in Nicole's eyes, it's clearly perceived as a relief to her. I would not say that with the family members.
Did you in fact see evidence of that relief in her jail visit with Joey when she's describing how much better she feels?
Yes, she laughed. She was like a child, giddy. She said, I can now weigh myself without having to worry about that certain someone. And she's clearly relieved because, and she's remained so, because she's no longer in fear of her mother. And it's not only mother's disapproval, this delusion has remained consistent throughout, that she thought her mother, once she became aware of all these failures of Nicole, and I've made reference to some of them, failing grades, she photoshopped her grades. When her mom found out and she lost her bike, she lost the keys to the storage room, she had an unpaid storage bill, and the big one, that she didn't have a dorm room. And that was because of her. She's in the clouds. She's on the computer. She's not doing what she should be doing as a college student. She thinks, well, when mom finds out about this, mom is going to be angry. Most parents would be, but she thinks that mom is going to be so explosive that mom's going to kill her. And she cites, and I want to just mention two things because they come to mind. She cites this, and she cites it repeatedly, and she believes it. She would use as evidence that her mom would kill her, that her mom had made comments, perhaps several times, that she was going to kill Bob with cake. Now, we all know that's ridiculous. Maybe the mom said that. Oh, I'll kill Bob with cake, But it's a ridiculous statement. But this was evidence to her that her mom was potentially kill somebody. So that's again, a very good example of how she perceived. And then she mentioned to me, and
Let me
I remember,
stop you real quick on that.
Yeah.
The evidence or what she believed was evidence that her mom was going to kill her because her mom had indicated that I was going to give Bob junk food or make him die. Did you also see, and again, you're evaluating her early on in 2015, that same belief 4 years later when
Absolutely.
Dr. Lazaro evaluates her?
Yes, the beliefs, the thing about her mom killing, and then that she was going to kill Bob with cake, consistent, and she believes that. And then I was going to add something she said from the very first evaluation, and it was an odd thing, so I just kind of, and then she said it again, and she's referenced it several times. She looks at me and she says, you can never know a person. And then she talked about a mother who put her child in the oven. And this she must have read about or it was on the news, not her mom. And this was sort of like data that supported that people can do things that you would never expect. So those delusions, and I can go through 13 interviews, or the 12, the last one was, this didn't come up, it was very brief. I can go through data in 12 interviews where unsolicited, except for the one where I go through the whole homage, she brings up this delusion that her mom would have killed her. She believes it fervently, and she's mentioned multiple times, would anybody doubt this? Because her mom would kill Bob with cake. Her mom had it sort of, she didn't use these words, but it was, she could do stuff like this. It was in her her makeup.
And that
of course,
delusional thinking
absolutely.
continued into the evaluation with Dr. Lazera.
Yes, did I see that? Absolutely.
Now, you
And
mentioned
in fact, go ahead. No,
you
it's
mentioned
fine.
failing grades earlier, and I just want to show you what's already been introduced as Defense Exhibit 8, a copy of Nicole's transcripts. If you'll look at that screen, just for the jury's benefit,
Yes.
and kind of, we don't need to walk through the whole transcript, but at what point does it appear her grades are beginning to decline as it relates to this transcript?
Okay, well, I'll do this quickly. I analyzed these grades. You've got 5 semesters if you count summer. You see where she went from basically a 3.0 average. Now, let me see where you would see that. But she's done very well in the beginning.
This is page 1. If you need to see
Okay.
page 2, there's page 2. Does that have the GPAs?
Yeah, but what you see, and I did sort of the analysis in my report, she goes from, and I'm just going to reference, she goes from like a B, a 3.1 or 2 in the beginning, which is very good. That's in the first semester, and that's when she's in London. And then it consistently goes down to the last semester where her average is about a D. It's 1 point something, and again, I can look at my report, and you see it going down consistently. So what that tells me, when I look at that, something's going on. I mean, obviously, this is a individual who got into the college, so she had the ability to get in. She got a 3.1 or 2 her first semester when she's in London. She comes back to, she comes to Tallahassee, and it keeps going down. Now, if this was, and some kids do this, they get on their own and they start partying and they're drinking, some start smoking marijuana, they start hanging out with their boyfriends, they're going out, and they fail out because they're irresponsible. This isn't what's going on with Nicole. She's not drinking, she's not smoking, she doesn't have a boyfriend, and she's not hanging out with her friends. So something's going on here, and then what I think is the retreat into fantasy. She's spending, according to those who know her, the 3 Florida State University girls, she's spending her time on the computer, and she's being Elsa from the Frozen character. She's into anime, and so that's, I would say, the explanation for the failing grades, or the decrease in grades.
Can you explain, well, first of all, just if you can briefly tell the jury what psychological testing is and how that's used in your field?
Yeah, I did a few tests, and the reason I like to do, I mean, it's good practice when it's necessary. If you do tests, it's another source of data, and again, you want to corroborate. So if what the client is telling you, the defendant is telling you, is consistent with the test data, it gives you like a more solid foundation to draw conclusions. So I do, usually I do, and particularly in a case like this, but almost in every case, a trauma symptom inventory. It's called the TSI-2. It's very well respected in the field. And so I did that test, and I did it twice. And I could talk about all the scales, but I'll just say right now, it has, and then I'll answer anything else, but I just want to say it has 2 validity scales. So what that means is the test, and many tests have this, and it's good, they have items in there to see if the person is responding honestly. And they have, in the TSI-2 and in some other tests, they have like if you're faking good because you want to look really good, or if you're faking bad, like you want to look really ill. And it'll pick that up, and it'll tell you don't count this test because the person is basically faking one way or the other. So I gave that to Nicole twice. I gave it to her right at the time she was right at the time she was arrested. And then I gave it to her 3 years later. So I would have had 2 validity scores on that in 2015 and 2 in 2018, 3 years later, and they were all valid. So that tells me the test data.
What does the test measure, though? What are you trying to accomplish?
Measures trauma symptoms, which would be expected if somebody really has endured a lot of trauma, that they would rate their symptoms would reflect on this scale. So it shows trauma-related symptoms, and it also shows things that are related like depression, suicidality, anger, and so forth. So that's what that test shows.
And did Nicole's scores on that test you administered, both at the time of her arrest and 3 years later, reveal as far as her scores in the various scales or areas?
Okay. There was a change, and this is important. In 2015, so again, this is within days of the shootings, she showed that what the test data did, and I can go into lots more detail, but I'll just give you...
I want you to go through the scales and what she scored.
You want me to go into the specific scales?
The
Okay.
4 scales, and again, just for your reference, I'm on page 31.
Okay, all right, okay. I thought you just wanted the conclusions. That's fine, all right. So 31, okay. Now this may get a little, this is a little complex, so I'll try to make this clear. She scored high on 2 factors there, and one of them is post-traumatic stress symptoms. And there, under this factor, there are 4 scales. And when I say high, meaning there are cutoffs that you use. I can go into more detail, but we'll just, for now, just say those cutoffs. Is that good, or you want the numbers?
Just what she scored on that on that test when you administered
Yeah,
it.
so what she scored then was high on the post-traumatic stress factor. That consists of dissociation. So what that means is being in sort of her own zoning out, spacing, not being, really part of what's going on. Intrusive experiences, what that means, again, part of the same post-traumatic stress factor, is that she's got experiences coming in that are traumatic. So when I told you about her sobbing when she goes to the 3rd grade, and then she brings up the 10th grade and the 11th grade and just breaking down, that's what we mean by intrusive experiences. They come in, they're still traumatic to her. The defensive avoidance, what that means is trying not to think about any of the things that bother her. One way of the defensive avoidance clearly is just going into the computer. She's not dealing with it at all. And then the anxious arousal. She will present as high anxiety. You see this in the police interview particularly. When she's with the nice policeman, she looks pretty calm. He's very pleasant. He engages with her. As soon as he's gone, she's very anxious. Now, when she was evaluated by Dr. Lazaro picked up the anxiety because I would think that Nicole understood that she was being evaluated, and this is serious at this point, but earlier on she didn't have that same anxiety in the context of evaluations. But you see that she's got this anxious arousal, and she's hyper vigilant with respect concerned about her mother becoming explosive and hurting her. So that is the post-traumatic stress factor. Then another one that she was very high on is what's called the self-disturbance factor, and that is depression. She's very high on depression. Insecure attachment, meaning she doesn't have good attachments to others. She's very sensitive. She's hypersensitive to criticism because she's been criticized, and she avoids relationships. So that's under insecure attachment. And impaired self-reference, what that means, she doesn't have a sense of self. She took that on, as I gave that example, what her mother says goes. She hasn't grown up individuated. I saw that in jail when she started to talk like the inmates. She never cursed before, and all of a sudden the language changed. So she doesn't have a sense of who she is. Which at 21 she should have a sense of who she is.
You indicated
so
3
those
years.
So those are the areas in terms of the scales.
Let me ask my question real quick.
Yeah.
You indicated 3 years later you re-administered the test, and there appeared to be a difference in the scores, and what do you attribute that to be?
Well, let me just say very briefly, some of the PTSD symptoms subsided, the dissociation, spacing out, daydreaming, not being there, just sort of avoiding the real world, that's still high. She still has that poor sense of self. So while you see some, clearly there's change. The change that you see is she's less, the post-traumatic stress symptoms have decreased. And to answer your question, why did they decrease? This may sound odd. However, she feels safer in jail than she did at home. And why? Because jail's predictable. Our jails in Hillsborough County, you may not know this, but they're open bay. What that means is that the deputy's right in the room with everybody. You can see, like it's almost like this courtroom. You can look around, you can see the inmates. And there have been research on this. These are actually safer than putting people in cells with bars or putting 2 people in a cell. So as odd as this may sound, it's a safe environment for many. For Nicole, she felt a lot safer in jail than at home. And what's important, remember, she thinks like a child. If you follow the rules, and the rules are pretty clear in jail, you're okay. Jail is predictable. So she was, unless we start talking about her mom and those incidents, meaning the things that really were traumatic, she's okay being, when I say okay being, she's not as frightened, hyper-aroused. She's not afraid that she's going to, she's not afraid she's going to get killed in jail. She feels it's a safe environment and predictable.
Can you define for the jury what battered child syndrome is?
Yes, it refers to like the long-term effects of prolonged and repetitive abuse, and that abuse can be physical, certainly sexual, emotional abuse. It's typically seen in the context of physical abuse, but it also encompasses the psychological abuse or emotional abuse. And it's similar to battered women's syndrome. There's some differences. And what happens, there's a collection basically of symptoms, you call it behavioral psychological symptoms, that are associated with learned helplessness, where people, and you see this with Nicole, they just sort of give up. They just think there's nothing they can do to better their situation. And it also includes symptoms of PTSD, which the test data show.
What is your opinion as to whether Nicole meets the criteria for battered child syndrome?
Absolutely.
And tell me, again, obviously you've talked about the abuse, but if you could just summarize what the basis of that opinion is.
Yes. Why I would classify her as a battered child is because of the extreme psychological abuse. There was physical abuse. As I said, it was not as extreme as I have seen in other cases. But the psychological abuse for Nicole was severe. And you have to remember, this starts when she's a baby in the sense of the conflict she's raised in. And what's really struck me is, there are reports that say, as a kid, these are doctors' reports, that she was a normal kid, she was happy. I watched videos of her smiling, I've seen pictures. Her brother said she liked to sing, she was active. And then the brother said, Joey, the spark went out, and other people talk about it. So why would this be? Again, it's the environment, the stress that this child has been raised in, and the psychological abuse where she's been attacked, undermined, to the point she can't even think, she can't tell me about what she thinks. She's got to revert back to what mom says at 21 to 25 years old.
What is your opinion as to how the battered child syndrome ties in to the homicide of her mother?
Well, I think this is, let me pull this together because I think it's very helpful. So you got this, remember, she's, her way of dealing with things is very simple, like a child. Then you have to think in terms of this battering, that the psychological battering, where she doesn't have any confidence, she doesn't think that she can handle things. And then she's literally terrified of her mother. Now again, you've got to go to her perceptions. And I say, when I say you got to, I mean that's in terms of thinking. This is what she thought that her mother, because of the stuff that was currently going on, was going to lash out in her in anger. And there's the college girls talk about how she was afraid of her mother. I've already talked about Uncle Eric talking about, at least in the depots, about being afraid of her mother, to the point of like terror. He even mentioned in a depot that if she was in the house at the grandmother's and the mother called, she would just leave immediately and not even say goodbye. So there's this terror, and family members noted, the girls noticed it at FSU. So I think that that's some of the data. I mean, I can go into specifics, but clearly she's terrified of her mom. Now again, we have to look at her. And I keep coming back, those are her perceptions based on her life experiences.
That's what I want to ask you. Based on the history of abuse that you've already testified to, did Nicole in her mind believe at the time that she pulled the trigger that her mom was going to kill her? Was that
Yes.
a true belief in her mind?
In her mind, absolutely, it was a true belief. And again, that's a result of the declining mental health that we've talked about, her being in a psychotic state at that point.
In your opinion, what were the 3 possible outcomes Nicole had at that moment?
Well, what Nicole talked about to me and to the others, she saw 3 possible outcomes. She could kill herself, which she had the gun and was thinking of. She could be killed, or she could kill her mother. That's what she saw as the 3 possible outcomes.
We've talked about the deterioration over time, the failing grades, the hygiene, everything in college. But how do you believe what was going on in Nicole's life, the dorm and things, at that moment, the LASIK, the week leading up to the killings, led to that deterioration, which ultimately led to her believing her mom was going to kill her?
Well, they're all coming to a head, and this is the accumulation of stressors, which is very important, and I've mentioned these, but they're now coming to a head. She had a nice time at Joey's. She gets back, but remember, I've already said the law of natural consequences. She's not paying attention, so bike stolen, then you've got she didn't pay the storage fee, she's locked out, she lost the storage key. She's got the failing grades, she photoshopped them because she was terrified to show her mother. And then she's got the LASIK surgery coming up, and then I think what is just critical for her, just sends her over the edge, is that she didn't have the dorm room. And she knows that expects, let's put it this way, that when her mother finds out that she does not have the dorm room, her mother is going to go up to school and she's going to find out everything else. And the everything else is just what I told you. And her mother's going to lash out and kill her. Those, again, are her perceptions. So what's critical is this dorm room. It sort of brings it all up to her head. Now, Joey did mention, and when I talked with him in September 2015, he said, yeah, his mother would have been angry with those things. It's probably a normal parental reaction. However, Nicole didn't just think her mother was going to be angry. She thought her mother would be angry to the point of killing her, and then she would be disappeared. I think she even used that word or that concept, that nobody would know and nobody would give a, I think she said, damn about her. And she didn't perceive Bob, the stepfather, Mr. Deans, as going to help her, and if her mother killed her, that, as bizarre as this may sound, that Bob would take the mother's side. Again, it's a child. Bob would take the mother's side, and so that was the situation. This is all in her mind, obviously.
Before we get to the ultimate diagnosis that you gave Nicole, Was that thought or fear that her mother was going to kill her, in your opinion, a delusional belief in and of itself?
Absolutely. I don't think for a moment that her mother would have killed her. Certainly no evidence that in any way that is accurate.
However, in Nicole's mind, that was her delusional belief at the time she killed her mother.
It was back in 2015, and the last time I spoke to her was in January. She still believed it, and in watching Dr. Lazzaro's clinical interview, she covered that very thoroughly in the last segment of, she did 3 days, and Nicole is steadfast. There's quite an exchange about that, and the doctor challenges her, and Nicole, she starts rocking and crying and sobbing, saying that what did I have to get killed? She believed even then, and this is almost 4 years out, that her mother would have killed her.
All right, I want to go, first of all, explain to the jury what the DSM-5 is.
Yes.
I want to go to the diagnosis.
Yeah, the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the 5 means it's in the 5th edition. It's a book that's relied on. It was published by the American Psychiatric Association. It's relied on by mental health professionals to diagnose.
All right, I want to go, and I'm just going to use this as a demonstrative aid, the actual book,
Okay.
to the section
All right.
on schizophrenia. Can you see that on your screen, or do you want a
No,
copy for you?
ma'am, I can see it.
All right, can you first tell the jury what is your diagnosis of Nicole?
I believe, based on my clinical evaluations, reviewing 13 meetings with her, and then the other evidence that I've seen and reviewing the other clinical evaluations done by the doctors and the data there, that she fits schizophrenia.
Okay. And again, we've just talked about delusions, but if you can explain paragraph A for us as far as the duration and when you believe the delusional thinking began.
Well, it says, and we go by this when we're diagnosing, so you need 2 or more of the following, and they give a list of 5, and it says each present for a significant portion of time during at least a 1-month period, and we didn't have treatment here, and at least one of these must be 1, 2, or 3. So we're looking for at least one of these ongoing for a month. So we have delusions which have been ongoing now for close to 4 years. I mean, there may have been, let's say there's evidence, there may have been before, obviously, the homicides, but clearly we're going on from the first time I met her, which was August 15th, to the current time. So we've got delusions. The delusions are that her mother was going to kill her, and then the other one is what I call these delusions of reference, and there are multiple ones. I was just looking even on the last interview, and it's not like I probe for these. I mean, she just talks about them because she rambles on, but the last interview in January 2019, she talks about signs she's getting from God still at that point, and she told me about, as luck would have it, when she gets to FSU, she has 2 dorm rooms. So she didn't know about, up until after Bob died or was killed, she didn't know about she didn't know about either dorm room. She gets up, she has 2. Now she interprets this as a sign from God that she went to one dorm room and the police went to the other room, and so this was a sign that God was protecting her.
What evidence did you see in Nicole with regard to hallucinations, the second portion of A?
Hallucinations, yes. I saw that in terms of the screaming. She mentioned that to me. She mentioned it in the beginning, has been consistent in saying there was screaming. What I thought was particularly significant...
And you're referring to the screaming in her head?
In her head.
Okay.
It's in her head, yeah. Which subsided after she killed her mother. She said it had been ongoing for a year. What I found is significant, when I went through the jail notes, and when she was first admitted to the jail, there is the admitting nurse, I believe it was, her name was Scherner, I think, or Schnern, I could get it, but she tells her on August 24th, 2015, that she heard the screaming voice, and so that's significant, she's reporting it. And she also reported, just for completeness, that she had been thinking about killing herself, and she gives a certain date, which is right in that time frame.
With regard to the hallucinations and when the screaming in her head, from the records that you reviewed, did it appear that that began sometime after her return from London, as she reported it to her brother?
Yes, that's what she, and I think she told that to me too. It's certainly consistent with my memory. This starts, because London was a good experience for her. She liked London, she had a good experience there. It's when she gets to Florida State University, everything starts to, or she's not able to meet the demands of college life, and the screaming starts. Her grades start going down.
And a time frame for London, we think, is about 2013. Is that your recollection?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it would be the fall semester of 2013.
Any evidence of disorganized speech with Nicole?
Yes, and I talked a lot about this, and it's still ongoing. That's what I meant by she can't answer a question. It's this going off on excessive extraneous detail, because that's how her mind is. And she can't answer a question directly. Sometimes she comes back to the question and answers it, and sometimes she never comes back to it. And it's interesting, in Dr. Lazaro's evaluation, Dr. Lazaro said at least twice, and I can get you the references, where she made, the doctor commented on the tangents, and at one point laughingly said, "Nicole, you're driving me crazy the way you go off on tangents." So that means that was obvious to Dr. Lazaro, the disorganized speech, which is representative of disorganized thinking, as of, I believe that was, well, it was either April or May of 2019.
Grossly disorganized.
Yes, and this you can look for lots of data for this, but I've already mentioned the police report. I mean, the police interview. I would certainly characterize her behavior then, the telling stories, the laughing inappropriately, giving riddles, as certainly evidence of disorganized behavior. Then if you think of the actual homicides incidents, you know, what happened there does not suggest somebody who has good reality contact. She shoots her stepfather, then from what I have seen, basically stays in the house. She does go and see her Uncle David to get $100 to pay the dorm bill, but she stays there, doesn't know what to do, wrestling with things, and then shoots her mom. So again, it's just suggesting that, you know, the behavior is not syncing up with a good thought process.
And talk to us about what negative symptoms are and which ones apply to Nicole. And I can turn the page.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Negative symptoms, what I would put here as very important, the lack of hygiene. This is a critical thing. And again, this is so far over the norms. I mean, that her roommates even put the mattress outside the suite because it smelled so bad. The roommates obviously, you know, had problems and rejected her. Uncle Eric said in his deposition 3 times he went back to it, how much that room, or let me say, he said the room stank and the mattress, but he also made reference to Nicole's hygiene and being able to smell it several feet away. So that's a very big symptom. It's a classic symptom. Then you see where she's not doing what she should be doing in terms of going the normal things of college. She's isolating. She's not being social. So I would certainly put that as a negative symptom as well. They call it asociality. The disturbed sleep pattern, it's certainly, I don't know that I'd put that, I'm just looking because you highlighted the DSM, I guess. But the point is, what I want to highlight, the negative symptoms that to me strike out are particularly the hygiene and the lack of doing the normal things one would do, being involved with others, which would be a withdrawal from others.
Dr. Heidi, you in fact made a graphic, and within the DSM-5, within the section where you find schizophrenia, they're characterized as schizophrenia, spectrum, and other psychotic disorders. Is that kind of the chapter?
Yes.
And you made a graphic kind of to just illustrate what that chapter kind of includes, and would that assist you in explaining the spectrum to the jury? If I put that on the screen.
Well, yes. I mean, sure, that's fine, and I did make this. I just wanted to, and I don't know if they can see this well, but I can highlight it. You know, you're looking at a continuum, and as I said when I started off, you know, she's in a psychotic state when this happens. And so if her functioning before then was good, and if she recovered, we put her in the first category, brief psychotic disorder, and that lasts a day to a month. But here, you don't see, we're 4 years out almost, and there's not recovery. And so all I wanted to illustrate, I was explaining this to defense counsel, is if you're looking about it, schizophrenia diagnosis in relation to time, you know, you often have a psychotic episode, but in this case, you not only have that active psychotic episode when she kills her parents, but it doesn't go away. So we're at this point where if it had only lasted 6 months and she got better, or she was in that period 1 to 6 months, let's say that, we would call it schizophreniform disorder. But the fact that it's ongoing, and it has been, we're almost 4 years out, and those symptoms, particularly, delusions are still there. Hallucinations don't seem to be, but the delusions are there very strongly. The tangential speech or the disorganized thought, that's there. And then what's also important, still having problems with hygiene. Even the state doctor noticed that in her evaluation, or April or May 2019, Nicole knows the doctor's going to come see her, and she comes somewhat unkempt, didn't shower, didn't brush her teeth, and the doctor even says, well, you know, you knew I was coming, and Nicole says, well, you know, I just didn't get up, and, you know, so you're seeing the problems again in functioning, and we're 4 years out.
And we're talking about 4 years out from the time of the offense, but you'd agree that these symptoms were beginning into 2013 before
Yes, and thank you, Counselor. That's a very important point, because when you see what the roommates clearly established, and this is why you want corroborative data, what the roommates help us to see, and the family, is that this way predated the shootings. In other words, the family's noticing, and with concern, that there's a problem with Nicole, and they know something's mentally wrong with her. They're suspecting it. And in fact, Joey related a conversation to me when I met with him, right, you know, again, within 2 weeks of the shootings, where Joey said to me, he said to his wife that he recognized that... Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to sustain.
Let's not go into what Joey may have.
All right, okay, all right.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Heidi. Were you able to, records, interviews, everything you've done in the last 4 years, able to point to any possible genetic contribution for purposes of Nicole's diagnosis of schizophrenia?
Yes, possibly. And I'll mention this again with some caution. I met with Mr. Nachtman for 4 hours. I think it was September 25th, so within about a month of the homicide. As I've already testified, he certainly loved his daughter. I think he still loves his daughter. But what I was struck by is we spent 4.25 hours together. and I have the notes, and I can show you this, and this is what I wrote 4 years ago. He couldn't answer simple questions. He would go on off into tangents. Sometimes I couldn't understand them. Or he'd tell me these long stories and then come back to the point. Then what I also noticed is he would laugh inappropriately, be talking about something painful and start laughing, which I would consider kind of bizarre behavior, because some of this stuff was painful. And then one of the characteristics associated with people with schizophrenia spectrum disorders is a lack of insight. And I read his deposition, and I believe it's right in the deposition where he said that, now remember, this is a man that has been fighting with his wife for years. Even after all the visitation was suspended, there's still conflict going on. He doesn't want to pay the child support. It's in the Florida Air Academy records, trying to see the child. So there's real acrimony between the mother and the father. And he says in the depo, well, there was no conflict between me, meaning him, and his Nicole's mother, Miriam, Mrs. Deans. So I'm thinking, that's bizarre, that lack of insight. So, you look at that.
Stop you there for a second,
okay.
Dr. Heidi.
Yeah.
Did you also, in regards to Mr. Nachtman and your 4.5, I think you said 4-hour interview with him,
Yeah.
did you also have an opportunity to review jail visitations that Mr. Nachtman was having with Nicole, where he exhibited some of those same behaviors without going into specifics?
Yes. Yes. The same difficulty sometimes. It was a little hard to understand, meaning because the way he was putting his thoughts together. But again, he clearly loved his daughter, no question.
Dr. Heidi, I may have missed this, and it would have been my fault, but I wanted to talk about what in the records, we talked about this, the development of Nicole as a child, the personality development. What did you ascertain from the records as far as how many schools Nicole attended in her childhood?
Well, from what I could determine, she was at 9 schools. Mr. Nachtman reported 14. But it seemed to me there were data to support 9. Could have been more. That's a lot of schools to be in as a child.
Judge, if we can approach.
Yes.
Dr. Heidi, I want to ask you now, and I'm going to put up in front of you the jury instruction on insanity. And I want to ask your opinion as to whether you believe Nicole was insane at the time of the offenses.
Okay, so to answer your question, I'm going to go through it. Person is considered to be insane when she has a mental infirmity, disease, or defect. I think that applies in this case. I think she has a severe mental illness. That's always been my position. And I think at this time, clearly it meets the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, which would be a severe mental illness. Then number 2, because of this condition, my understanding is that one of these must be met. And that is, she did not know what she was doing or its consequences. And I'm going to stop there for a moment. In my opinion, she did not understand or know the consequences of what she was doing. And that I can go further explain if you like, but that's where I think she clearly meets the insanity, is that she did not know its consequences of her actions.
And to be clear, and I understand you're not a lawyer, but the or between A and B indicates that either A or B has to be met, is your understanding after reviewing this instruction.
Well,
is that
that's
correct?
always been my understanding, yes.
Okay. Now, with regard to, well, first of all, let me ask you this. Did you previously testify in a battered child syndrome hearing before Your Honor and the parties were there asking you questions about these topics?
Yes, if you're talking about January 2019?
Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And were you asked a question as it relates to your opinion on specifically the McNaughton standard?
Yes, under McNaughton I was, and I did respond.
And if you could tell the jury, first of all, what McNaughton was and what your response was at the time you were asked that question about the McNaughton standard in Florida.
Yes. McNaughton is similar. In fact, I teach that. McNaughton is essentially a person is considered to be insane if that individual has essentially a mental infirmity, disease, or defect. And here's where it's a little different. Because of this condition, she or he did not know, I'm going to say he because that's normally how it is, because of this condition, he did not know what he was doing. Or you go to B, although he knew what he was doing, he did not know it was wrong. And so the difference in the jury instruction, when I looked at it, is in Part A that was very significant to me, where it said he, or in this case she, did not know what she was doing or its consequences.
Now, with regard to the wrongfulness part, or prong B that's in front of you, what has always been your opinion as to whether Nicole Nachtman knew that killing somebody was wrong under the law?
Under the law, yes. She did. She did. She understood that.
And when you responded to that question at the previous hearing, was that what you were referring to?
Yes, and that's specifically what I was asked. I was asked under McNaughton, because I've looked at my testimony. It's on, I think, page 257. And Mr. Terry asked me, did she know what she was doing or it was wrong? It's right on the record.
My question to you now, though, is has your opinion always been that Nicole did not appreciate or know the consequences of what she had done?
Yes, and it has been. There was a meeting, and again, I can...
I don't want you to refer to that. Just answer.
Okay.
It's always been.
Always, and it's in my report, and that report was dated, I think, October 17, 2018, and I can reference the pages where I said, and I'd like to take a moment here, if I may, just to say that it's always been my opinion she didn't understand the consequences of what she had done. And in fact, for over 2 years, she thought her mother was still alive, or her mother could still, let's put it this way, affect the outcome of what was going on.
Now, with regard to the consequences question, you've testified already. The jail visitation with her brother, not understanding really what she had done, the inappropriate affect in the police interview, and have those always been your opinions as it relates to whether she really grasped the situation that she was in at the time?
That, Mrs. Hersey, has always been my opinion, and it's documented in my report, 1018, and I can reference the page numbers. In fact, at one point, towards the end of the report, I say that she doesn't understand the consequences.
And so we're clear, your opinion as it relates to the law the jury will ultimately be instructed on, should the judge give this instruction, is that Nicole meets prong 1 and prong 2A because of the consequences.
That is correct.
If I can have a moment, Judge?
Yes.
I did want to elaborate a little bit on that. When you initially interviewed Nicole, or at any point during the 4 years, what did Nicole tell you could happen to her as a result of this case, or what she would accept as a possible resolution? She gave you some options.
Yeah, bro.
What did Nicole tell you would be possible options that she would be willing to accept in relation to the resolution of what had occurred?
Now, this would have been very early in the interview. It might have been, well, it was August 28, 2015. So this is 8 days after the incidents. And this is what I wrote on page 12. And the heading is Nicole's lack of appreciation of the seriousness of the offenses. And I have Nicole understood the charges and the penalties did not really grasp the seriousness of the charges for a long time after her arrest. And then I say the reason is due to her low personality development and her overall mental health, including her poor reality contact.
Dr. Heidi, just
Yeah.
tell me what
Okay.
the 4 options she gave
Okay,
her.
all right, here they are. 4 different punishments. 1, she is willing to be tortured for a certain number of hours to be determined. 2, to be banished from the state of Florida. 3, to give her earnings for a certain number of years to be determined to the charity of the juror's choice. Or 4, to keep a journal of her behavior while living out of state for a certain number of years to be determined so the court can see that she is, quote, a good kid, unquote, and eventually release her from supervision so that she can do good for others. And then she also stated 2 or 3 times that she did not want any of her mother's money and her brother could have it all. So again, that goes in. There are other references too. That's what she said 8 days after the homicide. She also said, and I think it's very relevant, she said she would accept a short sentence or probation, but she did not want a conviction because she wanted to go into the military.
Thank you, Dr. Heidi. I don't have any other questions.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're going to take a afternoon break before we begin the cross-examination. Please do not discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Please do not do any research related to the case, and please avoid any reports in the case outside of the courtroom. All rise for the jury. Jury is exited. Everyone may be seated. Doctor, you may step down. You may enjoy the 15-minute break. Please do not discuss your testimony with anyone unless all the attorneys are present. Mr. Terry, just an approximate, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break, but
Casey asked you questions.
Yeah,
That's
okay,
fine.
thank you.
One thing I would like the court to be aware, and I intend to discuss this, actually, if we can maybe do this approach the bench.
yeah, well, is it the witness you're concerned about?
Yes.
Dr. Heidi, I'll just have you step outside.